Okay, we're live now. Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today for our live Q&A with our Members' Choice Award winner, Elly Griffiths. Hi,
Hello.
everybody. Thanks again for joining. If you do want to just pop in the chat who you are and where you're coming from, it's always nice for Elly and I to see who's here while we're talking. But I did think we'd start getting the chat going by opening up to you guys to an icebreaker. We've been chatting before the session started about our favourite fictional detectives. So if you want to pop in the chat any favourite fictional detectives you might have, we'll go through those. But Elly, if you could please start us off.
Well, my first thought was Miss Marple because she's great, but also because I did write a Miss Marple short story a couple of years ago. The Agatha Christie estate asked 12 modern contemporary women writers to write a Miss Marple story, and that felt incredibly well, it was quite exciting, but also a little bit scary to sort of be given free reign to sort of work with Miss Marple, to have Miss Marple as one of my characters. I mean, I did try to make her as much like Agatha Christie's Miss Marple as I could, but obviously to sort of get ready for it, I reread all the Miss Marple stories, and I just love all the stuff about her. Oh, that reminds me of little Jimmy. You know, all the sort of elliptical way she comes to, and she's quite. I think she's quite terrifying in a way. They call her Nemesis in a pink shawl. One of the books they describe as Nemesis in a pink shawl. And I just think she is actually quite frightening. But I have another contender, which I'm going to put out there because she might be a bit less well known. She's called Miriam Birdseye. And she's in the Nancy Spain books. And I don't know if anyone's read Nancy Spain because she died tragically young, actually, quite a long time ago, I think in the 30s. But she's terrific. I think the books have been brought out again by the Persephone Press. And Miriam is a vaudeville actress. And I think the joke is she's quite a bad actress, actually. But in any of the books, if she gets a chance to act at all, she does it. And she's got a sidekick who's a ballerina, Russian ballerina. They're just a great sidekick, just a great double act. And if anyone wants to know where to start, there's a brilliant one about a pantomime called Cinderella Goes to the Morgue. And part 2 or part 3, I can't remember, is called Enter Miriam Dressed as a Principal Boy. So you can't really, you know. What about you, Annabel? Annabel, do you have a favourite?
I think I'm going to be very boring and say Sherlock Holmes, to be honest. But I've got massively into it when I was young. I must have been 12 or 13, I think, when the Benedict Cumberbatch series came out. And I became completely obsessed with Sherlock, watching all of them back to back. I think I even started a blog at one point writing about Sherlock, but that was very short-lived. And I don't think it's still on the internet, luckily. But I think Sherlock would have to be mine. If anyone wants to pop their favourite fictional detectives in the chat, that's what we're talking about. If you joined while we were going on about Sherlock and Miss Marple. But hi to Irene and hi to Kevin. It's great to see you. As they said in the chat from the Virtual Village Hall, if you do want to let us know where you're tuning in from, that would be great. It's really nice to see who is with us. And also let us know your favourite fictional detectives. I don't know if I can think of any other than Sherlock. I should be able to. I'll say Harbinder from Bleeding Heart Yard.
I'm glad you like Harbinder. So there's some great modern detectives out there. I really love Vera. I think she's terrific. Rebus, of course. Got quite a soft spot for Karen Pirie in the Val McDermott books. I think she's a terrific character. She's short as well, like me, so I like that. Leslie Thompson writes a really great series called The Detective's Daughter. And her sort of detective character is called Stella Darnell, and she's a cleaner. And I think that's a really clever idea to have a cleaner as a detective, because she's, she can be invisible. You know, she can move around, and she gets some great big cleaning jobs towards the sort of middle of the series. And there's one set in Kew Gardens, for example. I think she might soon be sacked because she does seem to always find a body when she cleans. But she's a really great character. So I think, there are lots of great women detectives as well. I think it's one of the things that I think the genre does really well, is these kind of women characters. And I think that's the thing about Miss Marple as well that really struck me is Agatha Christie obviously was making a point about don't ignore women, don't ignore older women, don't ignore older unmarried women. Because people do, particularly in the short stories, it's so frustrating and funny, is that people just keep saying, well, of course you wouldn't know anything about that, Miss Marple, would you? Despite the fact she's solved the other 14 stories in the book. You know, number 15, the singer, but of course you wouldn't know anything about that, Miss Marple. But of course she does.
Yeah, a lot of people seem to agree with you, Ellie. We've got Julie, who's Miss Marple is their favourite. And then we've got Kevin, who sticks with John Rebus as my local boy.
So we've got somebody from Edinburgh. Hooray. Hello.
Hi, Kevin from Edinburgh. And but Kevin has also said that although Harry Hole is very close second, although a bit further away.
Yes. The Yo Nesbo, isn't it? Harry Hole. Have you heard Yo say his name? Because it's Harry Hole. I can't do it. But it's, basically, I've been pronouncing it wrong for a long time.
And Angela has, she's tuning in from Norfolk, and she said that Nelson and Ruth are definitely up there.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you. Lovely to have someone from Norfolk.
And Kevin's tuning in from Musselburgh. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Sorry, Kevin. Holy. That's the pronunciation of Harry.
Oh, yes,
Hole.
I think that's right. Yes.
Harry Holy.
Harry Holy, yes. I'm in Denmark at the weekend, actually. I know Jonesbo is not from Denmark, but talking of Scandinavia. So I'm in Denmark this weekend at a crime writing festival, and it's taken me years to even be able to pronounce my books because I'm not very good at languages, but it's a really difficult accent, I think, for English people. And the first one, I'm trying to remember its name, but it's just not how you would imagine it pronounced.
Kevin's confirmed that holy is the correct pronunciation.
Well done, Kevin.
When he visited Oslo, that was what they said. So
yes,
you're the authority here, Kevin. We're trusting you.
Yes, you are. We totally agree.
Yeah. If the chat seems to have settled a bit, it might be a good time to get going with the questions, if that's okay with you, Ellie.
Of course.
Okay, so hi to everyone who's joining as we've been talking. We're really happy to have you here today for our live Q&A with Elly Griffiths. Thank you to the Virtual Village Hall for helping us to host this session. They're really great, and they run loads of other events, not just this one. So check them out. I'm Annabel, and I'm here from Listening Books. For those of you who don't know about us, we are an audiobook charity, and we provide audiobooks for people who have disabilities, illnesses, mental health conditions, or learning difficulties. I think the team will be showing our details throughout, so if you do think we can help you, please do check us out. But of course, that's not why we're here today. We're here to talk to Elly, our Members' Choice Award winner, all about her winning book, Bleeding Heart Yard. So thank you, Elly, for joining us today. We actually, looking at the chat, we've had loads of other answers, so maybe we should look at those before getting started with the questions. So Julie is tuning in from Devon, and she loves your books, particularly Ruth and Nelson. They're such believable characters.
Thank you. That's lovely.
And Pam has said, it's hard to choose a favourite apart from Ruth, but I love Nicola Upson's books of Josephine Tay as detective.
Yes, Josephine Tay as a detective. I love those books too.
Kevin's let us know that the office he visited was in Sophie's Gate, which is the very building which is supposed to house Harry's flat. So Harry Holy, I think. Harry
Holy, yes. Right. Interesting.
And Shona's favourite fictional detective is Lord Peter Wimsey.
Yes, he's a really good one.
Yeah, we've got loads of different suggestions as well, which is nice. A lot more inventive than my Sherlock Holmes.
Where better place to start really than Sherlock Holmes? I've got a bit of a shout out for Sergeant Cuff actually in The Moonstone, because it's often called the first British detective novels, obviously by Wilkie Collins, and he's such a good character. He's really the sort of template for the detective character who comes in after the local police have sort of bungled everything, and he comes in and he doesn't. We talk about the case, he talks about growing roses, and he talks about other things, but secretly he knows everything that's going on. And it's almost a cliche, that sort of character now, but I think he was the first like that. And it really struck me reading the book. And of course, at one point he gives another character a sealed envelope, and he says, if you want to know who did it, it's in the envelope. And of course, he's right. And it really struck me that nowadays an agent would say, oh, brilliant, let's have a whole Sergeant Cuff series. But in fact, The Moonstone was Wilkie Collins' only detective novel, and Cuff only appears in that one book. But if anyone hasn't read it, it's Wilkie Collins. It's the 200th anniversary of Wilkie Collins' birth this year, so it's a good time to reread it if anyone hasn't read The Moonstone. Cuff is a really good character.
Thank you. You've been giving us loads of great recommendations. I'm sure everyone's writing them down as we speak. But hi, Monique from Petersfield, and her favourite detectives are Nelson and Ruth.
Oh, thank you.
We've also got Kate saying hello from Kent, and her current favourite detective is Washington Poe, M.W. Craven.
Yeah, Mike Craven's books are terrific, and Tilly as well, the other character in those books, is such an unusual, brilliant character.
Yeah, I haven't heard of loads of these. I feel
Mike Craven, I mean, he won the Gold Dagger, I think, with his first book. I was lucky enough to get a proof of it, and I have to say, in my own defense, I knew it was brilliant. I immediately knew that it would be a huge success. So really worth reading those books.
Okay, thank you. Maybe now we should get started with the questions. But thank you all so much for your sharing your answers. That's been great. But I'll get started now with the Q&A. So if you want to get started thinking about your questions, I'm going to give a quick introduction to Elly. I'm sure most of you don't need it, but just to start us off. So Elly Griffiths is the best-selling author of the Ruth Galloway Mysteries, the Brighton Mysteries, and the Justice children's book series. Elly has not only won the Crime Writers Association Golden Dagger for her works, but she is also the Listening Books Members' Choice Award winner for Bleeding Heart Yard. And we're so excited to have Elly here today, so our members can learn a little bit more about the book, and so you can all learn a bit more about the book as well. So thanks again, Elly, for joining. If you guys want to start popping in your questions in the chat, we can get started with those straight away and try and fit as many of those in. But Elly, I was hoping we could start off by just giving a brief overview to Bleeding Heart Yard, just for anyone listening who hasn't read or listened to the book yet.
Okay, yeah, hello everyone. Lovely to see you. Here it is, Bleeding Heart Yard. That's the paperback. So this book starts with a detective called Harbinder Kaur, who does appear in a couple of my previous books, but you don't have to have read them to enjoy Bleeding Heart Yard. So Harbinder is a British Asian woman. She previously worked in a showroom in Sussex, but she's now had a promotion to the Met in London. And she's a little nervous about this. She's a DI now, and her first case involves the death of a prominent politician. And he dies at his old school reunion. And so Harbinder knows she has to tread very carefully with the investigation. But it leads her to a sort of a sinister club that meets at a real-life place called Bleeding Heart Yard. And a lot of you will know Bleeding Heart Yard is real. It's near Farringdon Station. And this group meet at Bleeding Heart Yard. So Harbinder kind of knows there's something going on about this, especially because the detective's been receiving anonymous notes calling him a bleeding heart. And then somebody else dies, and the body is found in Bleeding Heart Yard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a brilliant book if anyone hasn't read or listened to it yet. And we've got a question to kick us off from Monique, who said, I love your Ruth Galloway series in particular. Is there likely to be another one soon, as I miss these characters?
I was thinking somebody might ask this. It's great to have it straight out. Hi, Monique. What a great name. So as you will know, there are 15 Ruth books, and the 15th is called The Last Remains, and I've said it's the last for now. So if you have read all 15, I think you'll sort of see that it does tie up some aspects of the story, but I've never said that it's the last forever. So I'm pretty sure there will be something else about them sometime. The minute I'm busy writing another book, which I hope will be the start of a series, but I'm sure I'll go back to Ruth and Nelson one day. And in fact, there's I'm publishing a selection of short stories in June. It's called The Man in Black. and it does contain a new Harry and Nelson story. So it's a Harry and Ruth story, and it does continue from The Last Remains, which is the 15th book. So you'll sort of find out a bit what Ruth and Nelson are doing. So so there's that little bit. There's a little bit of Ruth and Nelson coming in June.
That's lovely. Kevin's asked, how do you start your stories? Is it a sense of place? Then you create a story to suit the location?
That's such a great question. And we were talking about place before, weren't we? Which, yes, for me, the place, it often starts with the place, I have to say. The Ruth book started with walking across Titchwell Marsh in North Norfolk, and my husband is an archaeologist making a comment there about prehistoric people thinking those sort of marshland places that aren't land or sea are somehow sacred. So that gave me the whole idea for the Ruth books. And with Bleeding Heart Yard, it did start with Bleeding Heart Yard. I used to work in publishing, and every year I meet with a couple of my colleagues from HarperCollins, which is where I used to work, and we always try and pick a place to eat that has a good name. And we met one time in Bleeding Heart Yard, and I was saying, I've got to write a book about this. So it really did start with the place. It's not initially a place that seems full of atmosphere, but it's just the name, and there's a very spooky legend attached to it about a woman who's killed and her heart is left right on the cobbles there in Bleeding Heart Yard. So it often is the place with me. Yeah, I have to say it's the place. And then maybe the character. I think with the Ruth books, the place and the character came together. I sort of imagined Ruth sort of walking across those marshes, really. But Harbinder was already there, but I could see her in Bleeding Heart Yard.
Yeah. I was wondering, when I was reading the book, throughout the whole novel, I really thought that anyone could have been the murderer, and there were so many different motives. I just couldn't place who it was going to be. So when you start writing these like murder mysteries, do you know from the very start who the murderer is going to be, or does that kind of unravel as you go along with the writing process?
It's a really good question, Annabel. So I've changed a bit with my process, because when I first started writing, I did plan the books out just roughly. Like, I'm not a spreadsheet person or anyone very techie, but in my notebook, I'd write like a rough chapter plan, and I would know who was killed and who did it. And about sort of 5-6 years ago, I wrote my first standalone book, which is called The Stranger Diaries. And it's the first book that Harbinder appears in, actually. I didn't write anything down. And it's actually my most complicated plot. And I kind of found that not having anything written down allowed me to be a bit more tricksy with the plot, maybe a bit more sort of labyrinthine with the plotting. It was less linear, I guess, because I hadn't got it written down. So now I quite often start a book and have no idea who did it. I just
Really?
I hope that it comes to me at some point. And it's quite strange, because you find yourself putting in all these clues and you've no idea what they're clues to. Obviously, when you finish, you can tidy it up a bit. But it does weirdly seem to fall into place. But with Bleeding Heart Yard, I did know who did it. I did know from the beginning who did it. So that was a bit different. But I did try to make it as difficult as possible. I've got a friend called Isabel Gray who writes crime novels, and she used to write for Midsummer Murders, that very long-running series on TV. And she said that the rule of Midsummer Murders is there've got to be 4 people still alive at the end who could have done it. And that's my rule, that there have to be at least 4 people there at the end who could have done it.
Yeah, that is very much the case. I would say with Bleeding Heart Yard. And when I got to the end, I had no idea who the murderer was going to be.
Good.
So it was quite a surprise. But then when I did find out, I started thinking back to little bits throughout and little moments that all made sense now that you know in hindsight. So I was wondering if you plotted it out and if you knew that the murderer was going to be the murderer from the beginning. We do have some comments. Pat has said, Pat's from Bramhall near Stockport. She totally agrees with the other viewers who love the Ruth and Nelson books, really need more. And Monique has, in reply to your answer, has said, thanks, Elly. Looking forward to reading The Man in Black. And Kevin's commented that, 4 surviving suspects. What a great rule. And yeah,
It's
that is a
quite a
great novel.
useful rule, I have to say. And I think if you read my first crime novel, which is the Crossing Places, the first Ruth book as well, I don't think I do that. I think there's possibly one suspect and he did it. So I have got a bit better about that.
So as you said that Harbinder is part of a series, we have Ruth and Nelson, who everybody loves. What makes you decide to continue with these characters into a series rather than leaving them alone as a standalone?
It's a really interesting question, and for me, it's quite an interesting sort of writery decision, actually, because there are some characters who you love and who you think maybe are quite successful characters, but you know that they couldn't be in a series. You sort of don't want to see them again in a way. But there are some characters who do sort of clamour to be heard. Like when I wrote the first Ruth book, which I said was called The Crossing Places, I only had a deal for 2 books, so I knew there would be a sequel. I had no idea it would be such a long series, but I kind of knew that Ruth and Nelson had this long relationship, really, that could go to a long series. So there are some characters who are like that. And so when I wrote The Stranger Diaries, which is sort of a gothic novel, really, about some murders that happen at a school that seem to recreate murders in a Victorian short story, I just had to have a detective, and in came Harbinder. So I just thought, oh, she's a fun character. She's quite acerbic. That's quite fun. I didn't really think I'd see her again. And I got to, forgive me, a little bit of name dropping here, because Val McDermott's always been very kind to me, always really supportive of me, been a mentor, really. And I sent an early copy of the book to Val, and of course, really wanted to know what she thought. And she rang me up, and she was so lovely. She said, I really enjoyed it. She said, I can't wait to hear what Harbinder does next. And I said, oh no, Val, it's just a standalone. You're not going to hear from her again. And she said, oh no, we'll hear from her again. She's got more to say. And of course, she was right. And there are some characters who just have that bit more to say. They might not be the most lovable characters even, but they are just the characters who you just know have it in them to sort of carry a series and just have that bit more to them. So there are now 4 books with Harbinder in. So the most recent one is The Last Word, which came out in January, which she's sort of a bit of more of a minor character in that one, because it's based on the group of friends in Shoreham, but she's definitely there in the book. So yeah, she's got a bit more to her, I think. So it is a really interesting question, and you can't always tell which are the characters that are going to be long-lived. I mean, Cathbad, for example, the druid character in the Ruth and Nelson books, he was just meant to be a suspect in book 1, but now by book 15 he's definitely one of the main characters. And I teach creative writing, and I always don't let my students say things like, well, the characters decide. I always say, well, you're in charge, you decide. But somehow he did decide, I'm afraid.
As you said, we do meet Harbinder before, but this is the first time in Bleeding Heart Yard that we see her in London in her new job. And a lot of your books, as we know, are set in Norfolk or Brighton, which are beautiful places, but very different to London. So did you find it different at all writing about London and the Met Police, who are so well known? Was that kind of a different kettle of fish?
And so infamous, really, recently. Yes, it was different. But I've always wanted to write about London. In fact, the new series that I'm planning now is set in London. I was born in London, moved to Brighton. The family moved to Brighton when I was about 5, but I was at university in London. I went to King's College London. And then after university, I lived there for 10 years. So I do know it quite well. And there are several places in Bleeding Heart Yard that are linked to my family. Barlby Road is one. It's where Harbinder lives with her flatmates. But it's where my family immigrated to England from Italy. So, and they all lived in that area. So my nonna and nonna lived in that road. So did my aunts and uncles. So it's kind of quite a special place to me. And I really love London. I really love the obviously there's some not nice bits of it, but I love those too in a way. And I think we sometimes forget, maybe we don't, but how historic it is. There's a whole layer of London that's called the Boudicca destruction layer. And it's when Boudicca came into London and burnt it down. And there's a layer, there's a layer of burnt material that comes from that era. So, all those layers, they do fascinate me. So, yes, so all the places I've written books do have some link to. So my grandmother lived in Norfolk, and we spent a lot of time there as children on holiday. I live in Brighton, so the Brighton Mysteries, and London definitely has a connection to me.
Oh, lovely. We've got a question from Pat, who said, do you think any of your books will make a TV series? Would love to see who would play my hero, Cathbad.
I'm so glad you like Cathbad. I'm going to come back to you in a minute and see who you think. So, well, the books have been optioned 4 times for TV, which is quite a process, really. And I didn't know anything about it when I first started writing. So a TV company comes and they sort of take the books off the table for a couple of years, and they pay you for that while they work on a series. So that's happened 4 times, and it's still not happened. And it's quite frustrating because you get quite a long way sometimes. You know, you've got writers, you've even got sort of cast, but it still doesn't happen. So they've now recently been optioned for a fifth time. So I don't know, it could happen. I've sort of stopped holding my breath about it now. Now, I have always imagined Cathbad as looking a bit like David Tennant, particularly in his kind of long-haired incarnation. So I don't know, Pat, if you want to pop in the chat who you think would play Cathbad. And the thing about the fact that this has been going on for so long is that the characters that I first thought of for the leads maybe are now, you know, out of the age range without sounding too rude. I've always thought Ruth Jones would be a really great Ruth, David Morrissey for Nelson maybe. But yes, who knows really what would happen. But in another way, I'm really grateful that I was able to write 15 books with just the characters in my head. And in your heads, you know, and in the readers' heads as well, because, you know, we're readers and the pictures are better in our heads, aren't they, really? And if they had, so when they were first optioned for TV, I'd only written 1 book, you know, that happened when I'd just written Crossing Places. And so it could have been that they'd been on TV for the last 15 years and we were used to those characters. Do you know what I mean? So in a way, I feel quite lucky that I've been able to write 15 books without them being on TV.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting take on it, actually. We've got a question from Amy, who's asked, it's interesting that you don't always know who the murderer is going to be when you start writing. Have you ever completed a book, then gone back and changed your mind about who the murderer should be in the next draft?
Yes, I have, yes. And in fact, I did it with The Last Word, which is the book out in January. Hasn't happened often. But it has happened a couple of times, and really it's almost like you finish the book and you think, oh, that's who did it. Obviously that's who did it. You know, I realize everything's pointing, you know, in my head to that person. So I have done that. Yeah, I have gone back and changed it, and it'd be quite interesting, you know, to think what would have happened in those particular books if the original murder had continued to be the murderer. But I suppose one of the things about not knowing yourself is that you are quite fair with the characters. Because if you do know from the beginning who it's going to be, you obviously are going to treat that character a bit differently. And one of the things you do is probably make them a bit too nice or too backgroundy. Whereas if you don't know who it's going to be, well, then you give them all the sort of fair share of the space. And you're not sort of playing games by keeping them a little bit in the background. So yes, I have done that. I was interested. I read, because we were talking about Miss Marple earlier on, I recently read Agatha Christie's diaries, and I always thought that she knew from the beginning, but no, she often didn't know. She often changed it. I thought that was so interesting. She just thought, who's the least likely, made it then. Really clever.
When that does happen for you, do you tend to make the murderer the characters that you don't like, or you don't like writing, or are the murderers kind of more the interesting people to write?
Oh, that's a really good question. No, I don't think so. In fact, a couple of times it's been someone I've got a bit of a soft spot for, that I've thought they probably did do it. And you know, that's quite tough, really, but has to be done. It's usually not the most obvious, or if you know me, the person you think I don't like, for example, someone who's horrible to animals or something. You know, it's not going to be them, probably.
We've got a question from Kevin, who's also been sharing some really great comments. For example, he has a 4D jigsaw of London, like a 3D jigsaw, but it builds upwards through time periods.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, I really want to see that. So if you do have any pictures when it's done, that would be great to see. But he's also got a question. So if you didn't originally plan 15 books, how did you work in such long character arcs across the series?
Oh, that's a great question, Kevin. Well, the character, I wish in some ways that I had kind of planned it better, and that I had the arcs in my head. So really what happened was that they did sort of emerge quite organically, which actually, again, a bit like the TV thing, I didn't plan it, but I'm glad it worked out this way. It is that it did sort of happen sort of naturally. So I was never sure. I'm not going to give any spoilers, by the way, but I was never sure what was going to happen at the end with the sort of three-sided love story of Ruth, Nelson, and Nelson's wife Michelle. I wasn't sure what was going to happen with that, so that did change book by book, and there were some sort of big events that happened to those characters that I hadn't planned. But in a way, I think that was quite good, because a bit like not knowing who the murderer was, if I'd always known, I might have been conscious of working towards that. So I didn't really plan those character arcs. They did just happen. For example, Cathbad is a slight spoiler, I'm afraid, but Cathbad's relationship with Judy wasn't planned at all. It really wasn't planned at all. And I was writing that particular book. I think it's House at Sea's End, and there's a snowstorm, and I'm thinking, there's Cathbad and Judy in the car together. Oh, they're going to Ruth's house. Oh, that's nice. Oh, they're going upstairs. What's going on? So some of the things I really hadn't planned, but they're sort of part of the fabric now, I think.
Monique's been sharing comments about how much she loves your book. So, for example, she visited Shoreham last year, and it was lovely to read and recognise the places in the book. So in the Harbinder stories, I think.
Thank you.
Sorry, go on, Elly.
I was just going to say Shoreham is a lovely place. People don't often go along the coast a little bit from Brighton, but Shoreham is and it's quite a good place for a crime novel, because it's smaller than Brighton. It's quite sort of artistic area, but there's sort of very rich people and very poor people there, which is always good for a crime novel. There's the sea, which is always useful, and there's even an airport so people can escape. So it's quite a good crime novel.
Pat's come back with her suggestion for Cathbad, and that is Ben Whishaw.
Oh, wow. He would be amazing, Pat. Such a great actor as well. Wow. Yeah. I might have to fight my friend Leslie Thompson for him, because she thinks Ben Whishaw should be Jack in her books, if anyone's read her books. But, he could be both.
Yeah, he could be both. Yeah, he's brilliant. Obviously, we are an audiobook charity. But talking about TV, I listened to part of Bleeding Heart Yard, and there's 3 narrators, not just one. There's Nina Wadia, Candida Gubbins, and Jane Collingwood. And it kind of, when you're listening to it, because there's these different voices, it kind of feels like you're listening to a TV program, like a TV detective program. I wonder if you had any involvement with the production or the casting of the audiobook.
Well, I'm so glad we're talking about this, because I love the audio version of Bleeding Heart Yard, and Nina, Jane, and Candida do an amazing job. And you're right, it's very exciting for the writer, because I haven't had the experience of seeing my books on screen. It's the nearest I've ever come, to listening to a full cast production of it. Nina's been the voice of Harbinder from the start, from Stranger Diaries, and I just think I really love her as an actress, and I think she does a really good job with it. So I have a tiny bit of involvement in that. Usually the audio producer gives me a selection of people, but it's quite small selection, sort of about 3 or 4 people, and you just listen to samples of their voice. But I sort of knew Nina from her acting work, so I always thought she would be a great Harbinder, but I think Candida and Jane are just perfect. I've just done a tiny little plug, because I've got a podcast called The Plot Thickens, which I find hard to say. But I've just on that had interviewed Jane McDowell, who's the voice of Ruth on the Ruth books. And it's really, really interesting. You've interviewed her, Annabel, haven't you, on your podcast?
Yeah, one of my colleagues has interviewed Jane McDowell.
It was a Neve, or I can't remember.
Jessica does our podcast.
That was a really good interview as well. So the Listening Books has a great podcast as well. But it was really interesting listening to her about how she prepares for the part, how she imagines the characters as animals. I thought that was really interesting, and how she's a very interesting woman, as a lot of actors are, aren't they? She had been a dancer, and she said the sort of physicality that you bring to dancing, also bring to reading aloud, which I thought was really interesting. So I just think it's wonderful. And certainly, you know, when Bleeding Heart Yard won your Listener's Choice Award, I absolutely always said I would share it with those 3 actors, because, you know, they make it come alive, really, and it's wonderful skill. During lockdown, I decided I'd read one of my books aloud on my Facebook page, and you can still find it if you go down far enough. And it was lots of fun, and it made me very connected to my readers. But oh my goodness, it made me realise how difficult it is. What a skill it is to be able to narrate a book. I mean, I was sort of coming across bits that I didn't recognize, and I wrote the thing, you know. So I really do. I'm in awe of their vocal talents.
Yeah, it is tiring for sure. Some of the books can be quite long as well. Like we recently added Philippa Gregory's Normal Women, which is a new non-fiction book, and it's about 600 pages. Wow. Like reading that would take some stamina. I think.
Really would. And you know, the way that they can do it without a stumble, or I mean, you know, you obviously have a couple of, but actually, generally speaking, they just go for it. It's really incredible.
Yeah, amazing. Kevin's asked. Oh, me too. Kevin's asked, are you much of an artist? Do you have any influence on the design of the book covers?
I'm not much of an artist, Kevin. I can draw horses jumping sideways. That's my skill. I love horses. But my mum was an artist, and one of my sisters is an artist and printmaker. But no, I'm not a huge, you know, I'm certainly not a skilled artist. And it's an interesting thing, really, because actually I think that authors shouldn't be allowed near their covers, really. It's a bit like with choosing the audio narrator. You're given a choice, but you know the way that the publishers want to go. And usually I don't see the cover until my editor briefs it. They work with the design company. And when I see it, it's almost finished. And I used to be, as I think I said, I used to work in publishing, and I was a commissioning editor. So I know that when you present it to your author, you basically saying, look, we all like this. And we know what we're talking about. So you don't want the author really to have much feedback, because it's a marketing tool, and it's very interesting, I think, because you look at a cover, you look at maybe cover of one of my books, and everything about it, from the image to the typeface to the look of it, tells you what sort of book it is. It tells you how much violence there is in it. I think you know from this that there's sort of not lots of graphic violence, but also not totally cozy either. So I think all those subliminal messages that you get from covers are so interesting, and really the authors shouldn't really comment unless they hate them, or unless there's something that makes it seem like the wrong genre. I think that's when you should say, you know, I think this makes it look a bit more like a historical novel, or this looks a bit too romancy, you know, then you should speak up. But the publishers are not going to make that sort of mistake, really. So my involvement with my covers is minimal. My job is to say, yes, I love it. And I usually do, because Quercus, my publishers, are terrific at covers. I'm going to just quickly show you, though. It's very interesting how different the American ones are. I'm just going to lean back and get you... This is the American edition of Bleeding Heart Yard.
Yeah, very different.
It's so different, isn't it? It's lovely as well, but it's very different. You know, my books are published in all sorts of languages, over 20 languages, and they're all really different. So I find that quite interesting. But yes, again, my job is just to say, yes, I love it.
We've got a question from Lizzie, who's asked, how long does it take you to write each book?
Well, for the last few years, I've been contracted to write 2 books a year. So it's taken me 6 months. You know, it's like everything. When I go to schools and talk to kids, I just say it's a bit like with your homework. If you have a week, you do it in a week. If you have it in a month, you're doing it in a month. You know, it sort of expands to fill the space. So for the last few years, I've written each book in 6 months. I try to write 1,000 words a day. And so the idea is that in 80 days, I'll have an 80,000 word book. And of course, it doesn't work out like that, but it's not far off that, weirdly. I don't, you know, I tend to write 1,000 words a day. I don't change them that much. I'm not a writer who does masses and masses of drafts. I basically just do the one, you know, my first draft is my final draft in a way, although obviously I make changes as I go along. So it takes, that's how long it takes me. But for the book that I'm writing at the moment, which is called The Frozen People, comes out in January, and is the one I said I was hoping might be the start of a new series. I've had a year to write that. So guess what? It's going to take me a year. I've got to deliver it in April next month, and I'm not going to be early. I'm going to be right on the deadline. So it kind of, it takes as long as you've given in a way.
Mm. Kevin's responded to the American version of the cover, and he said, wow, the American version looks much darker. I agree.
Yes,
it does. It looks very different.
That's really true. Although often the American ones look a bit cozier. I won't go galloping around my office again, but if you look up the American covers of the Ruth, oh no, here's one. So this is The Last Remains, and actually that looks a bit sort of, although it's got a skull on it for some unknown reason, that looks a bit lighter, I think, than the British ones. But certainly, I think the American version of Bleeding Heart Yard is darker. It's more conspiratorial. I mean, that's not Bleeding Heart Yard, I should quickly say. It looks almost like Downing Street or something, but that chimes in with the political themes of the book, so that's fine. And the British one's not Bleeding Heart Yard either. It's not that photogenic, funnily enough.
So you just mentioned the political themes, and in the book there is a lot of talk about politics, about climate change, like very current topical issues. So what made you decide to include these in the book and focus on them as a tension point?
Well, I'm interested in politics. I'm passionate about the environment and climate change, and I did sort of want those to be features in the book. It's not a political book otherwise, really, but I'm quite fascinated by the way that how we are as children is not always the way we end up. So two of the characters in the books are MPs. One is Labour and one is Conservative. But they've started off at very different positions, and you can't always tell, can you, how people are at school. Liz Truss, I think, famously was very left-wing and sort of Republican, and then she became Conservative leader. But if I'd written about that, nobody would have believed me. So that was part of the theme, really, about how people change. But I wanted climate change to be a part of the book, really, and it surprised me it's not part of more thrillers, really, because it's a huge issue of our time. It is quite shocking the way there is the way big business and big petroleum business do influence our leaders still. So I wanted to bring that in, but it's not heavy, but it is there. I always remember years and years ago, Ben Elton, the comedian, wrote a terrific book called Stark about this. And it's still incredibly relevant. So that's another recommendation. If you want a climate change thriller, Stark is another really good one about cars called Gridlock. So I'm just surprised there aren't more of those sort of things. But as I say, political stuff's not heavy, but I'm more interested in the human side, I guess.
We've got another question from Sue, who's asked, are any of your characters ever based on family members?
Really not, I have to say. I mean, I guess you don't always know who your characters are based on. People often ask me if Ruth is based on me, and I always say no, because I don't think really, well, we share an interest, we share a love of Bruce Springsteen and cats. That's the only thing, really. But, she's an archaeologist and I'm not. She's an atheist and I'm not. She's an introvert and I'm not. So we're not that. But who knows? Maybe all my characters are me. Certainly I can see me in Nelson, I have to say. I don't think they're based on any characters. But having mentioned Nelson, my editor Jane once said that she thought that after a bit, every author ends up writing about their father. And I think my dad's no longer with us, and he was Italian. So kind of different background to Nelson. But certainly I think there are bits of my dad in Nelson. He was an ex-racing driver, actually. So he always drove very fast, as Nelson does. So I think maybe a little bit of my dad in Nelson, maybe bits of my older sisters in Ruth, maybe, my Auntie Marge, maybe, but certainly not consciously. It's funny how I think everything is just such a sort of soup of everybody that you know. It's hard. I don't think I've ever based anybody on anyone that I've known well in life.
Kevin's asked a follow-up question from Sue's question. Do you ever fictionalize people you don't like and then kill them?
No, Kevin, I wouldn't. Yes, of course I do. I have occasionally, there was a teacher at my school who made an anti-Italian remark and he's been in 3 of my books, 3 times, twice as a murderer and once as a victim. And I'm not finished with him yet, I tell you. So yeah, sometimes I do, yes, and it's great. It feels really good.
Yeah,
I don't think anyone else would know apart from me, but yeah, sometimes I do.
It must be quite therapeutic in a way.
Well, it really is, yes. And as I say, I don't think anyone else would know, but I know.
Another thing that I like about your characters is that you focus a lot on women detectives, as we were talking about earlier. And Harbinder, for example, is very successful. She's one of the youngest women of colour to be a detective at the Met, and her team is largely female as well. Do you think that you do this consciously in an effort to get women into these books, which is kind of historically dominated by male policemen and things like that?
Yeah, yes, it is a conscious decision. Yeah, I want to write about women and women in positions of authority, and I want women to have conversations that aren't about men.
Yeah.
The bed shell test. When I wrote Ruth, I really made a conscious decision to want to write about a real woman. I hoped a believable woman, because there was a slight tendency at the time, I think not in British crime novels, maybe in American ones, to write about these women protagonists who are just impossibly beautiful, and they ran 20 miles for breakfast and they made a gourmet meal and all those, everyone was in love with them. I wanted to write somebody who was very confident in their job but maybe not confident in other areas of her life, and I hoped felt believable to people. And again with Harbinder, you know, it was a conscious decision. I took it quite seriously to write about a woman from a different cultural background to me. Harbinder's, you know, South Asian, Punjabi Sikh family. She's gay. She's not originally out to her family, but by Bleeding Heart Yard she is. So I took that quite seriously, and I did. Luckily, I have a good friend who's from exactly the same cultural background, from a Punjabi Sikh family. So she advised me a lot, and her mum advised me a lot on the food, and you know, and our Harbinder's home life. So I did try to get that right, because there is always an issue, isn't there, when you. I don't want my books to be full of people like me, because that would be really boring. And also I don't want them to exist in a white world, because that isn't the world I want to live in. And it isn't the world of London or anywhere else in Britain. Thank goodness it's diverse, and I want to reflect that. So I want to make the teams as diverse as possible. So given that, you know, I did consciously, you know, want to write about women in positions of authority. That's really important to me.
Yeah, it is very important to have that representation as well.
Yes.
Monique's asked, all your characters are very believable. How do you choose names for your characters?
Oh, that's a really great question, actually. Funny enough, my daughter's best friend is called Monique. I'm probably surprised that I haven't used it in a book yet. Names are really tricky and interesting, aren't they? Because I always say to my students, as saying I teach creative writing, that a name is instant backstory. So as a lot of you will know, my real name is Domenica De Rosa. And as soon as I tell you that, you can kind of place me, and its culture is Italian. Domenica means Sunday. I was born on a Sunday. I'm the youngest of 3 sisters. They'd run out of names. So just from that, you kind of know a little bit. It's a bit of, it's backstory, isn't it? It's a bit of biography just in my name. And I always ask my students, why are you called that? And there's some great answers, quite often because their dads went to the registry office and misspelled something, and then they were stuck with that name, or they were named after a family member. One of my students at the moment was named after the pet dog. She's quite good about that. But so there's always a story in names. So I do think carefully before I name a character, and I think, why are they called that? You know, why is that? You know, why have they got that name? But equally, we do always, writers always have sort of favorite names that they fall back on, and I have to stop myself having too many of those short C names. That there loads of Claras and Chloes and Claires in my book. I don't know why, really. I just must like that, and so I have to stop myself. And when I wrote The Nighthawks, and it's really great these days, because you write a book and within 24 hours people are messaging you about it. And as soon as I'd written The Nighthawks, people messaged me saying, oh, is the Neil Topham in this book related to the Neil Topham in A Room Full of Bones? Well, answer, absolutely not. I just used the name, and neither me or my editor, and I've had the same editor for all the books, had noticed it. So if you've got a Neil Topham copy, it's a collector's item, because in later editions I've changed his name.
My name actually has a funny backstory. My parents thought I was a boy, and I wasn't a boy. So I was meant to be Noah after a family member. And then I came out and they didn't know any girls' names. So my dad thought about the baby Annabel, the toy.
Oh.
So he thought, oh, it's a baby girl. We call her Annabel.
Oh, that's a great story. I love that.
That is where I got my name from.
Yes, well, and it's a very beautiful name.
Oh, thank you. And Monique's commented that she'd love to be in your book, Ellie.
Okay.
That would be
I'll
great
remember
honor.
that. One of the Justice books is dedicated to Alex and Juliet, my kids, and Monique, their friend. So yeah, okay. But I tell you what, if there was a Monique in my book, she would be a nice character. I couldn't not make her a nice character.
I'm sure Monique will be thrilled to hear that. You seem like a big fan, Monique, which is great. So I was thinking in particular about your character Anna, and something that she said that stood out to me. She's a writer, and she at one point she says she's wondering how she would feel if, as a writer, hearing her books read aloud for audio or other people hearing that. So I wonder, do you have the same experience? Do you listen to your books on audio, or do you find it a bit weird?
That's such a good question, and I've forgotten I'd said that actually, because Anna is sort of wants to be a writer, and that was always what she wanted to do. And in that way I was the same. It was always what I wanted to do at school, and like Anna, I was always writing stories in the back of notebooks and things like that. A friend of mine recently found, I don't know why she had it, my old French book, and at the back is a story, and I possibly should have been concentrating on my French. I would have got a better grade. So yes, it's a particularly interesting and quite intimate experience, I think, hearing your books read aloud. And I think it is almost more uncomfortable in a way, I don't know how to describe it, than seeing them in the bookshop. You know, you see them in the shop, you sort of think, wow, there's my book on the shelf, and I still think that, wow, that's amazing. But when you hear somebody reading them, they're real in a very specific way. So I've never listened to one of my books all the way through. But in fact, I have listened. I've actually listened to quite a lot of Bleeding Out Yard, partly because I just love those three readers and the way they interact. And after a bit, you can sort of forget it's yours, which is nice. But it is a particular thing. I had one of my Miss Marple story actually read on the radio last year, and again, it's my voice. You know, it's my voice. You know what I mean? My words coming out of Radio 4 just felt like an extraordinary thing, really. So it is. It's a very interesting thing, I think, listening books, but I'm a big listener to listening books. I love audio, I love Audible, listen a lot to podcasts as well, but I love hearing books, you know, read aloud. So yes.
April has asked, would you ever write a book using a character from your books already, such as Cathbad? He's an interesting person.
Oh, that's a great question. I've often thought about maybe a Cathbad prequel. We don't really know what happens to Cathbad before the Crossing Places, and he's had quite a life. It's quite useful to me because I can always fall back on Cathbad's, you know, wandering life, and he appears in the short story that's out in June. There's another bit of his life we find out about, but we know that he was born in Ireland, that he studied chemistry first and then archaeology. So there's quite a lot, you know. He's had a relationship. He's got a grown-up daughter. So there's quite a lot about him that we don't know about. So yeah, I'm certainly not ruling out Cathbad prequel.
Ooh, that's very interesting. We are running out of time, so if anyone has any last minute questions, please pop them in now and I'll try and get through those. Pam's got a question. Will there be more Brighton books?
Yeah, I think there'll be at least one more. So the last one was out last year. It's called The Great Deceiver, and it's taken the story up to 1966. So it's the series starts in 1950. So, and that's the good thing about writing in the past, is that it's the seventh book, I think, but you can make these sort of big leaps forward, really, which you can't if you're writing contemporary fiction, obviously. So I would like to get us up to maybe 1970. So I think there'll be at least one more.
Do these books, when you're writing about different historical periods or different places, does a lot of research go into them?
Yes, and I love the research, and actually it's great fun, I have to say, to write about the pre-digital age, to write about the age when people didn't have mobile phones and people didn't, there was no internet, and policing didn't involve DNA or even much fingerprinting. It is quite fun to write about those. You're allowed a lot more misdirection, and people can forget things and lose things in a way that they really can't now. So that is a lot of fun. But yeah, I love the research though. Research is great, and 50s and 60s are a great time to write about, because obviously there's so much in living memory. And I've spoken to loads of people who lived in Brighton in the 50s and 60s, and it was a fun place in the 60s actually. So I really enjoy that part of it. And the bit I like most is talking about sort of contemporary memories. I'm writing about the 19th century as part of my new book, and I've just really enjoyed reading sort of contemporary accounts just about how people lived. And I've got a great book actually here just on my desk called Strange Victoriana. I recommend it. So I love that sort of thing.
We have one more question from Monique, and I think that sadly that will have to be our last question.
Gone so quickly, the time.
I know. I can't believe how quickly it's gone. But Monique has asked, do you do all your research before you start writing?
Oh, well, that's a great question, really. No, I don't. I do a certain amount, and usually because of the way it's been the last few years that I've written 2 books a year, so usually I'm kind of writing one book and slightly researching another one. I've got a notebook going on sort of ideas. So researching is fun, as I've just said, and you could just do it forever. And the thing that I have to often tell my students is, now you've got to stop the research and write the book. So I always set myself a day to start the book, and I always do it. So there are always things that I haven't researched yet, so they will come as I go through it, because you don't always know what you're going to need. So in Last Remains, which was the 15th Ruth book, I knew it was going to be set around these Neolithic flint mines in Norfolk, in Thetford. But I hadn't been down them until about halfway through the book, when I got the chance to go down them. So I sort of knew that I would start not knowing that, and then halfway through I would know a lot more about them. So yeah, sometimes that happens, but you don't always know what you need to know until you get to that point.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Elly. We that is all we have time for, and I can't believe it. I'm very, very sad about it. I know, but a lot of people are commenting that they've really enjoyed, and it's been a great hour. So thank you for joining us, Elly, and thank you everyone for all of your questions. They've all been brilliant.
Yeah, they really have. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Annabel, or Noah, as we also think about you now. But thanks so much to everyone who's joined in the chat, and it's lovely to hear how much you've enjoyed the books. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you again, everybody. And just as a reminder, before we head off, we're Listening Books. We're an audiobook lending charity, and we have over 10,000 books, including our Members' Choice Award winner, Bleeding Heart Yard by Elly Griffiths. So if you think we could help, please do join us. Okay, thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.